the flux and energy of sensory stimulation is something that has its own reality and doesn't require thought to explain it to us. And also that it's immersive. There's a way in which we can just allow ourselves to fall back into it and to receive the stimulation. And I think those properties make it easy for people to switch in this way, to be receptive to the sensory world, and often to be surprised.
Hello and welcome to the Metta Hour podcast with Sharon Salzberg. I'm Lily Cushman. I produce this podcast. And today we're coming to you with episode 241. Sharon speaking with Zindel Segal and Norman Farb. Zindel has been on the podcast once before. This is his second appearance. And if you don't know him, he is a psychologist, a PhD. He is a distinguished professor of psychology at the University of Toronto Scarborough. He is also one of the co-founders of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And his research looks at the way mindfulness can promote regulation skills. Our other guest today is Norman Farb, also a PhD, but in neuroscience. And Norm is also a professor at the University of Toronto Mississauga and studies social neuroscience. And these two together have released a new book, Better in Every Sense: How the New Science of Sensation Can Help You Reclaim Your Life. So we're excited to have them on the pod. So a lot of this episode is discussing the core teachings of this book, Better in Every Sense, which primarily is looking at the ways we can resource from the sensory network as opposed to the default mode network. The default mode network is something that Zindel describes as the house of habit. And this is just a fascinating conversation about how we can use the sensory experience to open the mind to awe, to new ways of being, to solve problems. And this toolkit of sense foraging, which is the shift from thinking to sensing. So this is a super interesting conversation, especially if you're someone that's interested in neuroscience and psychology. I also want to mention Zindel, if you want to hear his other episode on the pod, he came on in 2020, episode 144, which has more of his origin story and just a little bit more about the history of his work in the field. So before we get to the conversation, a couple announcements for you. We had a wonderful 80th birthday celebration just recently for the one and only Joseph Goldstein. And if you missed that, it is now available on demand at IMS Online, which is the Insight Meditation Society's online platform. You can head over to dharma.org, dharma.org, and watch the really fun party we had. It includes a lot of archival footage, slideshow, performances, poetry, music, all kinds of good stuff. Also Q&A with Joseph and Sharon and Dan Harris. Also in the land of Joseph, he is offering a mentoring program coming up in the month of June through IMS Online as well. So if you're a student of his or just someone on the path and you have questions, this is a great way to get answers. You can sign up for that at dharma.org/Joseph. Our other big announcement today is that Sharon has a new course coming your way. In June, starting on the 19th, she's offering a 10-day online wisdom course on equanimity. Equanimity is the balance born of wisdom, and this is a topic that Sharon has not previously covered in any of her online courses, so we're very excited to bring it to you. It is a flexible 10-day program that's offered on a sliding scale model, so it's really accessible. Lessons are about 20 minutes a day, and you can do them whenever you have time. And Equanimity is kind of like the secret sauce for spiritual practice. It's like the balancing factor, especially in all of these other qualities we're developing, such as compassion, loving kindness, sympathetic joy. Equanimity is the way that we stay centered in the midst of all of that, both in our practice, but also the rest of our day. So we'd love for you to join us. You can learn more about the course and sign up for it at SharonSalzberg.com. You'll see it right there on our homepage. So I think that's everything for our announcements. Let's get into today's episode. Zindel Segal and Norman Farb chatting with Sharon Salzberg.
Hello, Zindel and Norm, and welcome both of you.
Hey, Sharon.
Hi, Sharon. Thanks for having us.
Where are you each recording from today?
Toronto?
Yep, we're both in Toronto, maybe a few miles apart from each other.
Everybody's
close
in
in
Toronto.
spirit. Yeah.
So, Zindel, this is your second appearance on the podcast, and for the listeners, you can check out Zindel's first appearance in episode 144, which came out in December of 2020, which feels like 10 lifetimes ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And Norm, a warm welcome to you for your first time here.
Yeah, thanks. I feel really grateful right now for you inviting us into your space.
Well, we're celebrating the release of your new book, Better in Every Sense: How the New Science of Sensation Can Help You Reclaim Your Life, which came out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook formats in January of 2024. So let's start with you, Norm. I'd love to hear how you came to this work and what brought you to this path.
Yeah, so I started off my graduate school journey in a affective neuroscience lab studying how the brain processes emotion. And I really wanted to learn how to do neuroimaging, like take pictures of brain activity. And I just happened to be in the right space at the right time because my supervisor, Adam Anderson, had just struck up a collaboration with Zindel trying to understand the very first sort of glimpses of what happens when people begin a course of mindfulness training. There'd already been some substantial work on advanced practitioners led by people like Rishi Davidson and Sarah Lazar. And these are sort of like the marathon runners of the mindfulness world. But this was a chance to look at the beginning of mindfulness training. And I was already the guy in the lab who already did yoga. And I wanted to get into this method of measurement. And as an undergrad, I'd done a deep dive into sort of existentialism. And I was sort of bemoaning the loss of, the first person perspective as I was getting more and more into these kind of quantitative sciences. So this was just like a beautiful opportunity to bring the phenomenology, the first person experience back into the forefront and build a whole bunch of, measurement around it and try to do something new and exciting. So, I got introduced to the project. I got introduced to Zindel. And I think for a few years, I was quite scared of meeting Zindel, though I've softened a little bit now. And we just jumped right in and looked at what happened when people signed up to do mindfulness-based stress reduction and asked questions about, the self and how they process negative emotions, particularly sadness, because of the really pioneering work Zindel had done showing that mindfulness techniques can help protect people against relapse into depression, where extreme sadness can be seen as a sort of bridge from regular emotion into something more pathological, like depression. So, and now here we are, 2 decades later, and we're still doing this work. And I started meditating along the way. I was skeptical at the beginning, and it's been a wonderful ride so far.
I'm sure you've discovered that Zindel is really very nice. I've had a lovely dinner at his home, for example. He's really a very nice person.
He's quite nice. I think he's a consummate professional. So as a sort of bumbling, imagine like a puppy dog bursts into your like China filled dining room. And he's sort of like, who is this guy? So yeah, I think I had to sort of I had to be house trained in a way. I had to earn my dues and show that I was useful on the team. And then we've grown to be really close collaborators. It's been great.
That's great. So Zindel, maybe you can tell me about what inspired you both to work on this book and to work together.
It's been a bit of a mission that came from both a sense of hope and despair on my part. I think the despair came from recognizing that having done everything that I was trained to do, conduct randomized clinical trials, publish in high-tier journals, and be very rigorous in trying to understand the mechanisms of how mindfulness and meditation can help people manage mood disorders over the long term. The impact, the reach of that work was super, super minimal. And so, without a way of disseminating this work and yet fervently believing in its helpfulness, I think I started to shift into the idea that can we provide people with some small exposure to a way of helping them do for themselves what a lot of people who are on a contemplative path are able to do for themselves, but without necessarily engaging in the structure of contemplative practice. And I hope that that doesn't sound too provocative or disruptive. It's kind of like my analogy would be looking at it from a public health impact. When a city decides to put fluoride into the drinking water, they're trying to do something to prevent cavities, but they're not paying to send everyone to the dentist, which would be sort of the surefire way of dealing with cavities. But fluoride can have an impact, and it can touch very, very many people. And so part of what we're trying to do in this book is to excavate some of the practices, intentions, and mindsets that we feel fall out of contemplative practice, but also fall out of all kinds of other ways of encountering exploration and discovery, and provide that to people with very low barriers to entry through multiple access points. And that's really how I convinced myself to engage in this writing of a book that got a very, very popular profile, and really curious to see how it's going to land, in the years to come.
It's so interesting because, I've certainly experienced meditation, or let's say mindfulness training, in different forms. One is, as you put it, the structure, the kind of formal practice where people maybe sit every day or walk every day, whatever posture they're in, but it's a very intentional, dedicated period to deepening, say, mindfulness and qualities like compassion. And the other part is daily activity, like drinking a cup of tea mindfully, doing a task mindfully. And my experience, and I'm very curious about what you found, is that, and my experience, personal experience, is that in order to use those little nuggets of time as a practice, a person had to be pretty highly motivated, because we're busy, we're overwhelmed, we're responsible for a lot. And to take the time to feel your body or to notice your breath or something takes a lot, to
Yeah.
really inspire that to be real.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. And as Zindel was saying, we're not trying to bypass or make irrelevant formal training, which can give you a depth of experience, of course, that you're not going to get from that one sip of tea. But the flip side of it, and I see this a lot also working with young college students, is everyone's so busy. Like, why in the world would you add one more thing to your plate, even if it's like it's just holding an intention? Like, why would you try to remember one more thing? And so I think a lot of what we're seeing is that there is a a story, a narrative that comes out of our work on emotional resilience and depression vulnerability that can give people a real motivation as to why they should care about feeling. Like, why should they care about their senses other than it's just this like kind of platitude, that there might actually be like a real evidence base from the world that being connected to your senses is important for your long-term mental health, and that when you lose that connection, the insidious thing often is that that loss is invisible. Right. And so kind of knowing that if we can get people to even have a glimmer of that, perhaps that gets them to think, maybe I will actually, taste the tea today. Because in the same way that we know that, maybe I should actually, eat a little better, I should get a bit more exercise. Having that knowledge is not sufficient to make everyone super healthy. But without that motivation, why would they even begin? And I think that's a bit of the fluoride in the water that we're trying to drop in with the book.
So the book begins by outlining something that many people who are, somewhat more comfortable economically are experiencing these days, which is a sense of languishing. It's a great word. It captures so much. And in a time when it's said to be a $1 billion wellness industry, you would think that languishing in general would be lower. So what's your understanding of why this is happening?
Well, I think languishing is a term that was coined and captured a lot of the experience of people during the COVID pandemic, where being able to make it day to day amidst an environment filled with uncertainty and threat was seen as the best that many people could do. And also, it reflected, I think, a release from structures and social networks that helped keep people in place. These things were no longer available, or they were prohibited, or very limited. I still remember people going to funerals here in Ontario where you could have a maximum of 10 people graveside and the rest had to view it on Zoom. I mean, so that was a real degradation of the kind of expectations we have around mourning, grieving, and other important transitions. And somehow languishing reflected this sense of being stuck, which when COVID restrictions relaxed and people were able to, travel more freely or frequent social spaces, it didn't pick up in quite the same way. And I think it left people wondering about certain meaning generation activities for them, which may have been left on the wayside. I think it also people asked themselves around ways in which they were happy, not happy, just sort of treading water, and what comes next. And I think the inability to answer the what comes next question is often difficult because many of those answers were conceptually driven. People were trying to use their thinking styles to answer questions that may have needed to be answered through a whole different mode, an experiential mode, a mode that evaluated present moment experience over future outcomes and future status. And so they were sort of trapped in a way without some tools of thinking about or implementing, probably more implementing, ways of stepping out of those conceptual thought loops. That would be my take on it.
I think a lot of people can relate very deeply to everything that has just been said. And, there have been a number of different neuroscientists on the podcast talking about the default mode network before, which you referred to as the house of habit, which is another great term. But you feel the solution to our languishing isn't there. It's in the sensory network. So I'm wondering if maybe, Norm, you can explain both the sensory network and the house of habit for the listeners, and how you landed in the sensory network as a solution for languishing.
Yeah, I think the parting line around, I mean, also from Eastern traditions, but in Western clinical traditions too, is it's sort of like all this judgment and thought, and from Eastern traditions, like the self-making, the identification that this is me and this is mine, is like at the heart of our problems. And so a natural inference would be to say, if I can destroy and somehow limit these mental habits of constructing everything in terms of myself, then I'd have no more problems. And so the default mode network, seems to be the part of the brain that really instantiates habit, including the habit to always turn towards self-reference, self-evaluation, and judgment. And it does seem to be somewhat overactive in disorders like depression. But what we found through our research, and I've come to see has some parallels in my limited understanding of some Eastern psychology, Buddhist psychology, is that the solution cannot be just to break down your sense of identity and your ability to know where you are, to orient yourself in the world. That's actually a sort of nihilistic philosophy. Like, I'm just going to get rid of all of my conceptual understanding and then I'll be happy. And instead, what we're seeing is that it's the inability to be flexible, to update, or to change what we know about ourselves in the world that leads to languishing. Right? It's not the fact that we have knowledge or that we have a sense of who we are and what we're up to and what we value. It's feeling like there's no movement there. There's nothing new. There's no sense of a trajectory in our lives that really, I think, capitalizes languishing. And if you think it's sort of first principles about, like, well, isn't there some brain system that takes new things in from the world and makes us at least be challenged to integrate that information into our conceptual narratives? It's the senses. It's literally the senses are the way we take information in from the world. They're the doors, right, in which the things that we don't already try to control or model or know are opened, and the chaos of reality, right, whatever that is beyond our own present understanding, floods in. And so the brain has really well characterized sensory regions, the first landing points of the senses as they get to the brain. And we can see that these are the regions that tend to be suppressed or inhibited when people are most stressed. And a consequence of that also is that we stop feeling it as deeply, and perhaps we even kind of go along with that because there's a temporary relief in not having to process all the information, including the information from our body when we're under stress. But the insidious part of losing track of our senses, of having this sensory network go offline or become more quiet than it perhaps should be, is that now we've also deprived ourselves of the information that things are changing. So from a place of despair, where's the signal that now, I'm curious, or just even slightly less despairing or hungry or whatever? It doesn't have to be pure euphoria. It's just something else. And the answer is that information can't get in because we've been protecting ourselves so well from having to feel things. So the sensory networks in the brain are just all the places where our sensory information from our organs, our eyes, our ears, mouth, the sense of the internal state of the body has its own sensory pathway, are landing in the brain and then flowing forward into our more conceptual places of interpretation and understanding. And if what's going wrong for people who are in chronic stress, who are showing great vulnerability to depressive relapse, for instance, and also people in the general community who just feel more depressed, all show this kind of same profile of turning away from sensation and being left only with their conceptualization, the story of reality. If that's what seems to be the pattern when things go wrong, it makes perfect sense that if we were able to re-engage with sensation, as chaotic and uncomfortable as it might be to have to feel things without knowing exactly what we're going to feel, to have to notice things without noticing and knowing exactly what they're going to mean, if that is available to people, that would help get people unstuck. It would help break away the same routine habit of self-knowledge and open the doors to something new, for better or for worse, but it would be different, right? And that's getting back into motion in life again.
Well, it sounds like, you're describing a process that's both scary and liberating, and I think about those adaptations so many of us made as children, for example,
Mm,
where people will so often say, it was such a terrible abusive situation. I left my body.
mm,
I left feeling. I numbed out. I wouldn't allow myself to feel anything. So you're reintroducing a new way of being, or another alternative way of being that is not relying on that old adaptation that might have been very smart, when you were 2 or 4 or 6 or something, but doesn't have to be the way you live right now.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think people are not acting against their own interests. We're doing the best we can to survive, and especially as children, but even in adulthood, just trying to move into a place where we can rationalize ourselves as being right instead of feeling how wrong an interaction has gone. It is probably a pattern that's learned quite early in life, just to protecting yourself from the things that seem overwhelming seems intuitive. And I think one thing we're really trying to communicate in the book is it's really, really hard for a person to see that absence once it's been internalized. Once, right, it takes a kind of courageousness and an exploration, and sometimes that might be frustrating and scary to go peer into, what's not there, what might show up if you were to open
Mhm.
those gates to sensing and the inevitable feelings that go with that once again.
So, Zindel, there's a whole chapter in the book on the house of habit. I love that phrase. So, I wonder if there's anything more you'd like to say about that and why we need a default mode network and what happens when we get stuck there.
I think that House of Habit is, as Norm said, it can be very useful. It's very much programmed and ingrained as a way of helping us automate and create routines out of behaviors that we don't probably want to expend too much energy thinking about. We just want to have them run on their own. Um, and also, there are powerful discrepancy reduction capacities of the house of habit, a kind of planning capacity to see something that is valuable, see something that's objective, see something that carries meaning for you, and help you get from where you are now to maybe achieving that. And it could be saving for a down payment on a car. It could be taking better care of yourself. It could be um, trying to find a romantic partner. It could be making friends in a new city. The House of Habit can help you put routines into place that benefit from previous experience, anticipation of the future, and it allows you to really work in your own interest. Now, the place where it sort of falls down is that these same capacities aren't always effective when it comes to regulating emotions. The House of Habit can provide us with routines that have been ingrained when it comes to dealing with negative emotions. Often, though, the emotions themselves are considered as problems to be dismissed, problems to be limited, problems to um, steer clear of in order to go on and live in a way that's less distressing. But what we've been finding is that these kinds of conceptual clues or propositions suggested by the house of habits, suggested by the default mode, um, they often fall short. And they keep these emotions in place in a way that they can reemerge, they can lead to other kinds of negative affects, they can lead to a lot of rumination, a lot of worry. And that when these negative emotions are in place, the other thing that happens is that um, they become almost concretized in thought, and people find it very hard to step out of these thinking loops. Now, the beauty of sensation is that there's an entirely different way of trying to relate to these negative emotions. I listened to a recent podcast when Jack Kornfield was on, and you were talking with him about certain kinds of reactions to suffering or to people dealing with trauma. And one of the first things that he was talking about was to create space around negative emotions. And when we're guiding mindfulness or when we're teaching mindfulness, there are a lot of phrases that people use, things like acceptance, things like moving in closer. My favorites tend to be allowing and letting be. But what is it that we're allowing and what is it that we're letting be? I think an easier way to connect with this process of creating space and becoming acquainted with negative emotions starts with the sensory signature of what these emotions feel like in the body, and the space of not only viewing them through thought and thinking, what they will do to you, what they say about you, how long they're going to last, but to watch them through a different lens of sensory movement, sensory flux, sensory intensity, and sensory signature in a way that allows that space to hold them in a different way than our minds are telling us. And so this is what is meant by stepping outside of the house of habit when the house of habit no longer, in a sense, serves us for dealing with some of our experiences, although it can be very helpful for dealing with a lot of others.
Here's a quotation from the book. In 1666, with the plague raging through England, Sir Isaac Newton left Cambridge for Woolsthorpe Manor, the Lincolnshire sheep farm where he was born. Forced to set aside the intensity of his studies in mathematics, he found himself with unaccustomed leisure, sitting under an apple tree in a self-described contemplative mood. Then he saw an apple drop to the ground. In a sudden flash, he realized how incredible it is that objects don't fall sideways or upward, but only downward. To make sense of this observation, Newton posited that some invisible force called gravity must exist. In that moment of truly attending to his senses, Newton saw the familiar act of objects falling as if for the first time. Breaking free from his driven and purely intellectual habits helped him revolutionize our understanding of physics. So we've heard different iterations of this many times, that you have to walk away sometimes from a problem when you're stuck to find the answer. So Zindel, I wonder if you can tell me what the neuroscience is behind that.
I'm going to punt the question over to Norm.
Excellent.
Yeah. So there's quite a bit of theory already around this idea that to solve conventional problems, we can just follow a script, but to solve problems where we don't really understand how to get to a solution, we have to do what's called breaking frame. We have to actually take in information because we're not sure what information is relevant to solving the problem. And from a neuroscience perspective, this is often studied by looking at what are known as these kind of aha moments. So like a favorite example would be you give someone this question. Say you're on a boat, and the boat has a porthole window, and the window right now is 5 feet above sea level, and you know the tide is coming in, and the water is going to rise 1 foot per hour, and right now the water level is 5 feet, below the porthole. So how long will it be until the water reaches the porthole? And so what we know how to do is to say, okay, 5 feet, and it's going up, 1 foot an hour. So that's, I don't know, let me check my math, maybe that's 5 hours. And if you answered that way, you would have done everything sort of procedurally right in terms of counting, feet per hour, but you'd get the answer wrong, because if that were the case, every boat would flood when the tide came in. And so to correctly answer this problem, you have to actually let yourself take in other information about, like, well, what isn't mentioned in this question? I'm on a boat, but boats float. I guess here would be one of those key little kind of connections, right? And my experience of boats is they don't just sink when the tide rises, right? And in fact, there's other phrases in English, a rising tide raises all ships. And so these random other snippets of associative information present you with the opportunity to have this kind of aha moment. You say, oh, wait, of course, the tide, assuming there are no big leaks in the boat, the tide will never reach the porthole. The boat will actually float. So the answer is it will be like an infinite amount of time until the boat breaks apart. It won't just be 5 hours. In the moment when you first realize, oh, there's a trick here, there's something about boats I wasn't considering, that's known as this kind of aha moment. And what we see in the brain, to finally, in my long-winded way, answer your question, is that this is a profoundly rewarding experience, and often it is a sensory experience. So there was actually a recent study with like a 7 Tesla magnet, which is like one of the strongest, magnets you can make to scan people's brains in MRI, that showed a lot of the reward circuitry, and actually the very like brainstem, like to the core of your spine. There's this flush of activation when people have this aha moment. But the past, 10 or 20 years around this type of research suggests that a lot of the limbic or like deeper sort of mammalian parts of our brain, not really the conceptual parts of our brain, and the cerebellum, which is in the back of the brain that helps us, coordinate balance and being in the world in a real, like, don't fall over kind of sense. These areas are the ones that are actually the most active leading up to these aha moments. And while you do need a lot of conceptual machinery to filter out, like, oh, this isn't working, I should try something else. In other words, to kind of switch where you're paying attention. It's the sort of overall feeling of like, am I on the right track, or is the way I'm thinking not getting me where I need to be? It's not actually leading to a new solution that has to fire for us to break frame, as I talked about before, to really think like maybe I should try something different. And in this way, I think this idea of turning to sensation is not necessarily always going to reveal solutions to begin with. Sometimes it just reveals to us how deeply stuck we really are. We kind of see like the habit is running and the feeling is not what I want. The feeling is sometimes emptiness or sometimes something really negative. And although the machinery of habit, the house of habit, the default mode network is operating exactly as it should be, the product of this machinery feels there's some kind of error here, and that can be really motivating to then pursue. Okay, well, what else am I not looking at? And we talked before about motivation. So where does that motivation to do this scary thing and embrace uncertainty, embrace sometimes intensity or something you learned maybe wasn't safe before come from? And paradoxically, it's really starting to get to know what it feels like to be stuck, to have that kind of mismatch between an expected solution and the reality that you're not really getting anywhere.
Well, this brings us to another great term, sense foraging. What is that? And in the book, you say resilient people have sensing brains. So, what does that mean?
Yeah, I'm glad you like that term.
I do. I love it.
Yeah, we have a definition of sense foraging, which is basically purposely shifting attention from thinking to sensing with receptivity to the sensory world and a willingness to be surprised. So there are a couple of elements to it. One of them is an attentional shift, but maybe in contrast to some of the definitions of mindfulness, which don't anticipate any kind of outcome, we are suggesting an outcome here. I think the first thing we're suggesting is thinking and sensing are different. Thinking is not sensing, sensing is not thinking. And then receptivity to the sensory world, and I think we'll talk about it in a little bit, is that it's really not that far away from us in any moment, the sensory world. And then the willingness to be surprised, I think, connects back to what Norm was talking about, breaking the frame, the house of habit and its ability to predict our experience, sometimes through sensory contact, can fill us with a sense of surprise of things are not always how we anticipate them to be. And of course, does the world need another definition of sense foraging or attentional shifting or this or that? I don't know that it would have been convincing for us to do this unless we had some really strong evidence that this makes a difference. And when we wrote about resilient people have sensing brains, this comes from data from one of the largest neuroimaging studies that we conducted, and it was published in 2022, of people who had recovered from depression and were followed for 2 years. And they were scanned before and after mindfulness-based cognitive therapy or cognitive therapy taught to help them prevent future episodes of relapse. And what we found was that people who in the scanner were induced to feel temporarily sad were shutting down the sensory parts of their brains and activating the parts of their brains that were involved with problem solving and planning and self-referencing. So sadness did this to everyone in the study. People felt sad. Many of them thought, is this a problem? Do I need to do something about it? What does it say about me? How can I manage this? And then when we followed people over 2 years, what we found was that the folks who were able to retain the sensation of sadness while they felt sad, in other words, the parts of their brains that were still able to provide somewhat of a sensory experience of sadness versus simply a conceptual experience of it, had a much lower rate of relapse over 2 years compared to folks who, when they felt sad, just fell into a more house of habit driven way of dealing with the sadness. So the ability to retain sensory information when feeling sad seemed to be protective and seemed to contribute to the resilience of these folks over 2 years. It may not have been the only thing that was going on, but the actual effects were quite strong and suggested that however people arrived at this ability, because cognitive therapy and mindfulness cognitive therapy, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, they don't really resemble each other very much. But people were extracting from these therapeutic experience something about managing their negative emotions by keeping the channel to sensations alive. And so that gave us some confidence to suggest that sense foraging, however arrived at, might be something that contributes to resilience.
So these are the 3 steps. Do you want to go over them again, of the 3 steps of sense foraging?
Sure. Purposely shifting attention. So that's bringing your attention under a sense of your own control and shifting from thinking into sensing with receptivity to the sensory world and a willingness to be surprised. And the other thing I would add, Sharon, is that the reason that we feel like this is something that has a low bar to entry is that we feel that connecting with sensation can be very easily accomplished. And a lot of it has to do with this intentionality, willingness to be surprised, receptivity. And when we talk about receptivity, it's a way of allowing a sensation to reach us. We don't need to go out and seek it. In a way, we can recognize that sensation is ubiquitous. It's all around us, whether it's sound, whether it's color, whether it's touch, whether it's smell. We may also recognize that sensation is sufficient. That whatever sensations we're engaging with, we don't need to do better than that. We don't need to improve on that. These are sensory signals that we can connect with, and that sensation is concrete. The flux and energy of sensory stimulation is something that has its own reality and doesn't require thought to explain it to us. And also that it's immersive. There's a way in which we can just allow ourselves to fall back into it and to receive the stimulation. And I think those properties make it easy for people to switch in this way, to be receptive to the sensory world and often to be surprised.
Well, I've been listening, I promise I really have, but I've also been at the same time thinking, like, where is the equanimity in this, because and you've just explained it, I think, really well, because I figured it must be there, right? It's not simply feeling a sensation and then hating what you're feeling and feeling you shouldn't have it and, I've been in therapy forever, why is it still here? Or
Mm.
why couldn't I feel this long ago? So there's something about not dipping back into that conceptual world of judgment and allowing yourself to simply feel, with emphasis on the allowing, that I think brings in the role of equanimity.
Yeah, I mean, I think I personally have learned a lot from how you've taught about compassion, loving kindness, and even in our initial emails, I think there's a bit of a correction in how I phrase something, Sharon, about what if my understanding is correct, and I'd love to hear your take on it. That a lot of times in a compassion or loving kindness practice, what you're really getting to know is the feeling of the intention,
Mhm.
and you can't necessarily. And it could actually lead to problems if you get too attached to the outcome of that intention. Like, I want to feel love to this person, and I don't. So
Right,
now what do I do?
right.
I think there's a parallel there with one of the central points that we're trying to communicate to people, which is at this heart of opening up, especially when someone has this habit that we see of shutting down in the face of stress, of strong negative emotions. The thing that you have some power over is getting to know that intention to move back into sensation, right? Whether the feeling shows up or not isn't really always up to us, or whether an insight shows up or not. Newton realizing that that gravity exists, that's out of our control. And so I wonder if there's kind of like that really is where the equanimity comes in, is that we can really stand strongly for an intention. We get to become familiar to us. We can learn how to set that intention, and then we kind of have to let it go. And that's where the openness to surprises. Sometimes the surprises, nothing happened. And that's where I think having more experience, having teachers, having a community around you can really help normalize that. Not every moment stepping out of thinking is going to be bliss or mission accomplished. In fact, it's just the beginning of starting to see new patterns, right? Of having things occur that you previously had learned to become blind to. Does that kind of resonate with?
Yeah, no, it resonates a lot, because part of my thinking was maybe a secret ingredient of being open to surprise is actually equanimity. Because you can't be dismissing what you're feeling, or deciding you need a better feeling, or you shouldn't have the same old feeling, or you really have to be present and open to be open for surprises. So I thought it was in there as well, and it's. I think you're right, and thank you for the reference to loving kindness. I think it's very similar, because people despair. I don't feel the right thing. Where's the emotion? I have no heart. And where's the love? I've never known love. And all we need to do is really get more present behind that intention and see what opens up out of paying attention differently, which is really the way the practice works. So we are recording on April 9th, 2024. And just today I was reading about a study about physical touch. I don't know if you've seen it. It's some giant thing about the power of touch with premature infants and adults as well. And but regardless of that particular set of studies, since touch is one of the variables for experiencing sensation, I thought it was an interesting coincidence. And of course, our lives can look very different. Maybe we don't have like a puppy to cuddle, or person, or something like that, but we can have this internal sense of connection to sensation, and certainly pay attention to the world around us in a very different way. So Zindel and I have had the opportunity, just in casual conversation, for me to bring up something that I'm very interested in, which is interoception and its possible relationship with empathy. So my very first meditation teacher was S.N. Goenka. This was January of 1971. And the particular technique that he taught was what we call these days a body scan, which he called sweeping, where you move your attention through your body, feeling the sensations that may occur, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And I had read one study some years ago about that kind of sensitivity. You can define interoception better than I can, but that kind of sensitivity to internal sensation is also a bridge to empathy, and haven't read anything affirming that since. So I wonder if you could define interoception and say if you feel there's a relationship with empathy.
Yeah, I mean, interoception is my favorite topic.
I'm so glad.
Try not to
Mine
not to go
too.
on too long. So first of all, I just want to say, from the perspective of the book, we're not so strongly aligned to interoception, which I'll define as, the felt sense of the body's internal state, like our knowledge or the representation of the body's internal state. Because for many people, it might not be the easiest path into sensation. So I think I have the position. I think there needs to be more research done on this. That some sensation, regardless of what modality it is better than just always being, stuck in your head, stuck in habit, stuck in, reification and conceptualization of experience. And we can see, I think we'll come back to this, like access points that are very exteroceptive about the representation of the world outside the body. But I think interoception has some very unique properties to it. One of which is it is where we get the visceral components of our feelings. And our feelings are the building blocks of our emotions and the building blocks of our motivation. So if we really want to understand what lights us up and what shuts us down in life, we want to understand why we're reacting the ways we do. We could try looking, on a closed circuit TV camera of our behavior and deducing what's happening. But the more proximal cause is this feeling of, oh, I like this, I want more of this, or I don't like this, I'd like to get away from this type of feeling. So pleasure and pain, which are sort of core interoceptive senses. And from my own recent neuroimaging work, we also see that paying attention to something like the breath or the body, which are core practices, as you're mentioning, in mindfulness traditions and Vipassana traditions. There may actually be something special about that compared to the external senses. So, in a recent study that just published in 2023, we're able to show that when people focus on their breathing, rather than just turning up these sense factories for interoception, we actually see a quieting of a lot of the rest of the brain. Whereas if someone pays attention to something visual, you see the kind of vision factories in the back of the brain lighting up and using up more metabolism. And this is kind of paradoxical because it seems like whatever you pay attention to should get more sugar and oxygen burning and fire up that machinery, unless you consider the idea that our brains, and by extension, who we are as physical embodied beings, are always taking this information to account. And this seems necessary, for instance, to keep our breathing and heart rate in some sort of balance that keeps us conscious and alive and walking around and doing the things we need to do. And so to engage in interoception, what we actually might need to do is quiet down other sources of noise, both conceptual and sensory. And the very act of tuning into an interoceptive signal that's always been there, but we've learned to ignore to get on with all the other things we have to do, is itself an act of quieting and allowing. And so without having to provide any conceptual, theoretical rationale, mumbo jumbo argument, you name it, at that level, just by giving the instruction to pay attention to the breath, for instance, there's a bit of there's a brilliance there, because if you can figure out your way to do that, what you have sort of stumbled into is this ability to actually quiet other signals down. And the way we do that is not by getting angry at them or anything like that. We just have to let them pass. And what's left, because it's always been there, is the feeling in the body. It's where it's the first feeling we probably started with. So I just think it's such an amazing and rich topic. And when you think about someone who, despite external circumstances, still feels this sense of languishing or dissatisfaction or unfulfillment, and they think, oh, well, it must be this higher, more elevated theoretical actualization, transcendence path. But yeah, maybe, but maybe it's really just something happening at this visceral level. And to bring it full circle to the study you're talking about, the role of touch, like, it sounds kind of cliche, but what if it's like your body just doesn't feel safe and you needed a hug, and you're so busy doing more important things that's sort of, that feeling just like is sort of tainting everything, that feeling of not being supported, not being loved, not being safe. So I still think it's just a radically underappreciated sense of interoception. We still have the idea that we're going to think our way or obtain our way into feeling good, and we definitely have those reward conditioning processes with the outside world. We spend such a small amount of time getting to know how we actually feel without manipulating things and what really we need. So I think that interoception of attention is at the heart of maybe developing some early ability to quiet down and have a bit of the spaciousness that may be the beginnings of equanimity. And it also provides this basic building block of emotion that can turn into empathy for other people, like our natural reaction to seeing other people's conditions, and empathy for ourselves in our own situation. Because it's really where our emotions are coming from. If we were to take the time to look, instead of just predicting that, if this happens, I get angry. If this thing happens, I get happy. It's an act of sense foraging to say, well, do you? Like, well, can you take a moment just to check if that's true, rather than just assuming it's there? And are you willing to be surprised? And that's where new insights can come, where you can say, wow, it doesn't feel how I thought things were going to feel. I wonder what the pattern is here. And if we spend enough time checking in, maybe we'll notice, well, there are really things that make me feel safe or happy or warm, and other things that fill me with aversion or other types of experiences. But I need to take the time to get to know what that looks like for me now, rather than just expecting it and checking things off or being frustrated when it's not there.
Well, it always made sense to me. One of the reasons I'm so passionate about the topic is because it always made sense to me in terms of relationship with empathy. Because if we're talking about not just a kind of conceptual empathy, but a felt sense of what,
Mm.
ooh, that likely hurts, what you're going through. We feel it in our body, and that's where we feel it. Something is resonating. And if we're blocked or we refuse to allow the painful feelings that we've had in the past to be acknowledged, then uh, we're not going to be able to resonate very easily, And so it makes total sense to me that it's very connected with the development of empathy. So here's to more research. I hope it happens. I should also say that you have a number of resources in the book for different access points, as you call them, for sense foraging. So I wonder if you'd like to go through some of those.
Sure. This is where we've tried to make sense foraging as accessible as possible to people, and we've divided it into a kind of grid where there are sense foraging exercises or activities, actually, that you can do on your own, and then you can do with others. Some of them that are very accessible, and some of them that are less accessible. So, for example, going for a walk in nature is something that you can do on your own, or you can do it with a group. You could always do it with someone who guides you through a very pristine natural environment, or you can also do it by traveling and going to unique locations. All of these will give you an opportunity to sense forage, but it's up to you to decide what kind of access you might want. Looking at art, appreciating art, is another way of engaging sensory information in a way that may not have been anticipated or predicted. There are lots of different ways of doing this, either on your own, with other people. Psychedelics is another way of looking at sensory experiences that are created pharmaceutically. We're not recommending that in a wholesale fashion, and certainly not recreationally, but it is possible that in some jurisdictions that people can experience changes in sensory configurations through psychedelics that I guess hew closely to the motivations of being receptive to the sensory world and a willingness to be surprised. Travel is another way in which a low bar access point for sense foraging might be to take a walk around a new neighborhood in the city in which you live. A high bar sense foraging activity might involve traveling to a different city and exploring it that way. As you can see, all of these are activities that can leverage the intention for receptivity and a willingness to be surprised. They're not activities that require a meditation practice as a prerequisite. I mean, we do talk about contemplative practices, mindfulness, yoga, other ways of allowing attention to dwell in our bodies, and understanding what that is like. But it's one of a number of different activities that sit side by side. And this is, I guess, our attempt to try to move a little bit more towards the fluoride in the water model. Recognizing that this is our first foray. And I think as we've been talking throughout the podcast, there may be some background training required to really be able to participate in this, or possibly this may be a way in which people, once they've participated minimally, might become organically interested in biting off a little bit more for themselves and finding their way on a path that may represent or resemble something that's a little bit more akin to contemplative practice.
Oh, that's beautiful, and I think a noble goal. So, may it be so. More fluoride in the water. That's what I would. And thank you both so much for being here today and sharing your work with our listeners. Before we finish, I'm hoping that you would lead us in some kind of practice to bring our conversation to a close.
Sure, sure. I mean, to be honest, I had a bit of trepidation in um, presenting this to you, Sharon, because as you know, and as your listeners may know, when John and Mark and I were developing mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, the series of audio cassettes that you recorded with Joseph Goldstein were the ones that were on heavy rotation in my car and
It's
at home,
fabulous.
and all of the lessons around not striving and no outcome and allowing things to be were, I think, things that I absorbed and understand. And here, there is a little bit of a departure in terms of asking people
Mhm.
to um, be receptive, to look for surprise. And the reason for that is because I think those are some of the elements which can help unlock people from the house of habits. So we'll see what happens. This is a young concept, and we'll see what kind of traction it takes. What I'd like to do in terms of a practice is to guide a 3-minute breathing space um, from this perspective of sense foraging. And there is a way in which the house of habit can present us with an idea of what the 3-minute breathing space is, what it should be, how it should roll. And so the invitation here really is to see whether we can be receptive to any surprises that emerge as we do this practice, to maybe notice a step from thinking into sensing, and then just seeing how it lands. Would that be okay?
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Okay. So let's begin by, first of all, finding our seat and coming to sit in a way that feels comfortable and supported. Um, Maybe feeling the pressure in the soles of the feet, the chair supporting the weight of the body, the spine rising up from the pelvis with the neck and head balanced. Just sitting. And then when you're ready, perhaps shifting the attention from sitting to looking into the mind. Maybe asking yourself, what is my experience right now? What thoughts are here? What feelings are present? What bodily sensations are making themselves known? And as best you can, allowing all of these elements to simply be here, watching, observing them from one moment to the next. And now seeing if you can let go of the contents of mind and bringing your attention to a single pointed focus on the breath at the belly, the chest, or the nostrils. Feeling breathing right here in this region of the body as it's happening. Feeling the air coming into the body, the belly lifting, the friction at the nostrils or the chest expanding. And on the out breath, the belly falling, the chest deflating, or the friction at the nostrils once again. And just giving the mind this one thing to do, staying with this gentle rhythm, breathing in, breathing out, moment by moment as best you can. Now seeing if you can expand your attention around that region of the body, allowing your attention to radiate outwards from the belly or chest or nostrils into the whole body, and feeling the whole body sitting and feeling the whole body breathing. From the crown of your head to the soles of your feet, one whole breath, one whole body. And then when you feel ready, just opening your eyes and returning your attention back to the room.
Well, thank you so much for that. It was really wonderful and wonderful to share this time with you today.
Thanks, Sharon. Always
Yeah.
a pleasure to connect with you.
Thanks so much for having us. It was really great having to chat and share some of these ideas. Appreciate it.
Hey folks, thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Zindel and Norm's book, Better in Every Sense, you can head over to the website betterinEverysense.com. Get yourself a copy of the book. And for all things Sharon, including the new Equanimity course, or a couple of new audiobooks that we released this year, and all the other good stuff, you can head over to her website at SharonSalzberg.com. This has been the Metta Hour podcast, brought to you by the Be Here Now Network. May you be safe, may you be happy, may you be healthy, and may you live with ease.